Hello everyone, I welcome you to CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. This lecture is the second part of the lecture on African American poetry, Langston Hughes. So in the previous part of the lecture, we had talked about Langston Hughes, the poet. What are the conditions that shaped his thought? What are the values that he grew up with? How he is, he believed in a sense of, pride for the African American. He grew up in an environment where his family, particularly the grandparents, believed in the abolitionist cause, and ultimately he also started writing poetry quite early and was a very active participant in what we understand as the social, intellectual, artistic movement of the Harlem Renaissance. Right? Having looked at all these points, now in this lecture we are going to take one poem of his and understand how all the points that we've discussed so far directly apply to the text that belongs to him. Now this text is called, it is a 4-stanza poem. It's called The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and it was written in 1921, the first poem that Langston Hughes ever wrote. Now let's read the first stanza. It says, I have known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Right? Now over here, we see that there is a constant refrain of river. I have known rivers that are ancient as the world, but also older than the flow of human blood in human veins, which means what? That these rivers that existed even before humanity came up on this planet. My soul has grown deep like the rivers, he says. Now we see that the speaker uses the symbol of rivers to express his thoughts about the history of racial prejudice against African Americans. That's the first thing that we say. That here the word rivers is a symbol which expresses his thoughts about the history of racial prejudice. Now you might wonder that how do the rivers symbolize racial prejudice or history of racial prejudice, right? The reason is that rivers evoke the idea of civilizations which flourished on their banks. We all are aware. For example, Nile is associated with Egypt, right? Congo is associated with Africa. So great civilizations we have seen historically, they flourish along banks of some important rivers. So therefore, rivers then evoke the idea of civilizations which flourished on their banks. And in the context, these civilizations are the ones with a history of slavery. That is why Langston Hughes says, I have known rivers ancient as the world, right? Which means that he says, I'm aware. I'm aware about these rivers, these ancient rivers, in the backdrop of which a lot of civilizations came up, and these civilizations were the slave-holding civilizations, right? The next thing which we notice is the word known. So we see that certain words are repeated in the stanza that we just now read. The first is the word known. I know these rivers. I have known these rivers. So there's an assertion, in fact, he says it twice. So what is the significance of the word known? The speaker emphasizes his awareness of the history of this practice. He says, I am aware, right? The African American is aware, has knowledge, knows what has gone behind him, and which again is a part of culture as well, being acquainted with your own history. And we all also are aware of the fact that knowledge is one of the sources of power. So right at the outset, when the poem repeats the word I have known or the phrase I have known, A, it emphasizes his awareness of the history and the practice of slavery. B, it also showcases knowledge, which is one of the foremost tools of an empowered self. So right at the outset, an empowered selfhood, a sense of knowledge, a sense of awareness is established. The second repetition that we notice in the first stanza is of the personal pronoun I. He says, I have known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. So I and my, right? All these are words that also catch our attention, right? Now with this, what is the significance? Once again, the selfhood of the speaker stands reinforced, right, with these words. Then the third thing that we say about the first stanza is that after he establishes, I have known the rivers, I know the civilizations, I know the history of slavery, then he likens the depth of his soul to that of the rivers. What does he say? My soul has grown deep like the rivers, right? Which means what? He says that it implies that he has a sensitive understanding of the experience and suffering of the people at the altar of this inhuman practice. My soul has grown deep as the rivers. Over here, the word soul implies a sensitive understanding, right? A sense of relatability to what? He says that my soul is as deep as the rivers. And what do the rivers symbolize here? We just discussed. They symbolize the slave owning civilizations. So when he says that my soul is as deep as the rivers, it points to the fact that he has a sensitive understanding of the experience and suffering of people at the altar of this inhuman practice. Okay? So that was the first stanza. Let's come to the second stanza of the poem now. He says, I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. Right? Now this is the second stanza. What do we see here foremost? He mentions these different rivers, Euphrates, Congo, Nile, etc. Very famous rivers. And then he also mentions Abraham Lincoln, a historical figure, American president, right? New Orleans, again, a place with historical significance. But the first thing is that his mention of the multiple rivers in the poem is not merely for the sake of rhetoric, right? That's the first point we make about the second stanza. That the mention of the multiple rivers is not for the sake of rhetoric, but the purpose is to show how widespread slavery was. Why? Because these rivers that he mentions are not only near America, but they are all around the world. Euphrates, West Asia, it is in West Asia. So this river originates in eastern Turkey and it flows through Syria and Iraq to join the river Tigris. So, this is one of the rivers on the banks of which a slave-holding civilization flourished. Next is Congo. Now this is a river, of course, which is situated in Africa. The third reference comes to the river Nile. Now this flows through Africa only to ultimately join Egypt. Now the civilizations that flourished on these rivers have a history of slavery, and the black speaker is aware of it. So these references then once again indicate, emphasize that the African American is aware. He or she knows not just of his or her own immediate surroundings, but of the world as well, right? So on the one hand, these reference to these rivers, which are all in different parts of the world, shows that how slavery was somewhere a practice in different parts of the world, including America. At the same time, this reference also points to the fact that how the African American is very well aware of the world outside, right? Second point that we say about this stanza is that the speaker here associates these water bodies with a personal experience, as if attempting to make them his own. Let's look at these sentences. He says, I bathed in the Euphrates, right? I built my hut near the Congo. I raised pyramids above Nile. So what is he doing? In all the references that come to all these rivers, there is a sense of personal experience that he associates. That's how he visualizes these rivers. So in the Euphrates, he bathed at early dawn. He built a hut near the Congo, and as for the river Nile, he raised pyramids above it. Now here, the sense of belonging hinted at is not the one that one has towards one's homeland. So you see, why is he using these personal imagery, right? I did this, I did that on these rivers, etc. Why? So because of course he's establishing a sense of belonging to these rivers, right? He's not seeing these rivers as entities that are let's say maybe passive objects of observation for him, but he is actively engaging with them in different ways. So this sense of belonging then, which is hinted at, is not the one that one has towards one's homeland. You see why? Because these are rivers from different parts of the world, while he is from America, right? Why does he talk about Congo? Why does he talk about Nile? Why does he talk about Egypt? Why does he talk about the other even West Asia? Because he wishes to highlight the long history of slavery, which connects slaves from Africa in different parts of the world. So you see how creatively he does this. Just by mentioning rivers from different parts of the world, he is able to connect the experience of the slaves from Africa in different parts of the world, right? He establishes therefore a sense of community amongst the Africans. So that is one of the important features that we notice in this stanza. The second point that we make is about this stanza is that after coalescing racial history with the self, the speaker also refers to a factual history too, right? Now where is the factual history? The reference to Mississippi and Abraham Lincoln, right? So the reference to the Mississippi River brings alive the historic moment when Abraham Lincoln sailed down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, which brought about Lincoln's knowledge of the slave markets in the area. What does Langston Hughes says? I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I have seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. Now you see, this is actually a reference whereby, Abraham Lincoln, before he became President of the United States, he actually sailed down the Mississippi River and went to New Orleans to really understand, to see the situation over there. And after that as well, he rallied against slavery. So you see, that's why he says that the waters of the Mississippi River that were muddy before that, they turned all golden in the sunset. Why? Again, this is a symbolic way of indicating that with Abraham Lincoln and his presence and his efforts, a lot positive was done to the cause of the African Americans, right? Because he himself also was an abolitionist too. Next stanza, he says, I have known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers, my soul has grown deep like the rivers. In this last part of the poem, we see that the speaker reiterates his knowledge of these rivers, the consequent civilizations and history associated with them. He says these are ancient, dusky rivers. Now the word ancient almost always brings to your mind a sense of past, a sense of history, right? So when you call a river an ancient river, you know that it has seen a lot. And what is it that these rivers that Langston Hughes is talking about, what is it that they have seen? They have seen the historical reality of slavery. The civilizations which were around them, they practiced slavery. And he says, I have known these, right? So a sense of history, a sense of knowledge, a sense of awareness, sense of culture, sense of community. All these points come up as we look at this poem carefully, right? Now these rivers are ancient and dusky, and that is the extent of the speaker's racial awareness, right? Ancient and dusky. So his racial awareness or awareness of the issues is not only restricted to the contemporary times, but he's aware about the history. He's very much aware about the past. And he seems to be referring to them with a sense of pride. Now you see, you must connect all these points. First, starting with a sense of knowledge. Knowledge of what? One's history. Through history, what comes up? And establishing of the fact that, one is aware. Awareness brings knowledge, brings power, right? With that, what happens? A sense of culture is established. Through that, a sense of identity is carved, as the poet, talks about these rivers. Thereafter, we see a sense of community is also forged, as he gives references from the past, not only from one particular region, but from across the world, to again indicate that how this is an issue which is not only restricted to one part of the world, but is spread over, and he is aware of it, right? So the extent of the speaker's racial awareness then is very, very important, and ultimately connecting it to a sense of pride, right? And we see that in the poem there is a refrain, my soul has grown deep like the rivers. What do we mean by refrain? Refrain means a sentence or a phrase which is oft repeated, right? Now this refrain brings home the point that he is not just involved cerebrally and culturally, but is also emotionally invested in the reality and history of his race. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. We discussed that how the soul is not only, it goes beyond mere thought and culture, and brings to mind the idea of emotion, right? So the soul, which is deep like the rivers which symbolize these civilizations that have a big history behind them. They have a vast, reference behind them of slavery. His soul, likewise, is also deep. Why? Because it is aware of those experiences. It is aware of, the struggles of the African Americans. And it's not only an intellectual awareness, but it's also some kind of an investment, an emotional investment. That's why the word soul. You do not use it very casually, right? So with this, Langston Hughes concludes his argument in The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Now, if we come to the title of the poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, it's a very, I would say, very straightforward title. Speaks of rivers means that he's talking about the rivers. And also look at the word the Negro. It comes in the title of the poem itself. It doesn't come anywhere in the poem, as you would have noticed, but it's there in the title. Does it ring a bell? We discussed what? That during the Harlem Renaissance, the term New Negro was a characteristic phrase, and it embodied a sense of pride. Yes? So when he says that the Negro speaks of rivers, there's some theorists have talked about this idea of the negritude, means the aspect of being an African American, the reality of being an African American and all that comes with it. So he is aware, he accepts openly, confidently his identity as a Black American. Therefore, right at the outset in the title itself, with all the confidence, he says, the Negro speaks of rivers, right? So again, when you look at the word speaks of, it seems to be the case that he's, talking generally. But when you go deeper into the poem, you see that these rivers symbolize something, right? A particular experience. And how, through a discussion around the rivers, through a direct, I would say, engagement with history, Langston Hughes is able to touch upon all those themes which we discussed are, kind of essential or are intrinsic to the movement of Harlem Renaissance. And the other very important thing that we notice about the poem is its language, which is in the first person. Once again, a first person reference establishes the identity of the speaker. And who is the speaker? The title itself clarifies. It's the Negro, right? So this poem then becomes one of the ways of asserting oneself, giving space to one's thought, one's expression, one's emotion. And that becomes a way of forging a counter discourse to racial discrimination. So if we, for once, step slightly away from the thematic concerns and look at the form of the poem as well, look at the language of the poem as well, we see that we see the reference to the personal comes up quite sharply, right? And there's a significance to that. The other thing that we also notice is that, the words are very straightforward. We do not see him play a lot with language. Why do you think that that would be the case? Perhaps because he wants his message to reach as many people as possible. Because there is a reason, there is an aim to his writing, which is what? Instilling a sense of pride in the African Americans, and also reviving that confidence, a sense of culture, a sense of dignity, and most importantly, to bring everybody together. Right? This sense of community, which is forged by such artwork, is very, very crucial to the African American aesthetic. Right? So with that, I hope that we, will now be interested to pick up further other poems by Langston Hughes as well. He's a prolific poet. He's written a lot. His jazz ballads are also very, very interesting. I would urge you to read his other poems with all these ideas in mind. Thank you.